This is Jim Fetzer, your host, for a highly unusual first hour of The Real Deal, where I have been induced by two individuals I've come to know and respect, Sophia Smallstorm on the one hand, David Weiss on the other, who believe that there are reasons for taking the idea that the earth is flat seriously. Having a PhD in the history and the philosophy of science, where the history of science is dominated by the history of astronomy and physics, I have been highly skeptical of this proposition. However, at their request, I am featuring David Weiss this evening, who has a podcast, Further in the Rabbit Hole, and a second now with Mike Adams' new network, Truth is Stranger Than Lies. And he is going to make a presentation for the first half, and then I will make comments of my own thereafter. David, welcome to The Real Deal.
Jim, I just want to say that I respect you. You are the bulldog of truth. You are relentless. You are able to hold so many facts in your head and regurgitate them effectively. And I'm impressed by that. We don't agree on some things. I get a lot of heat for having this debate with you because of your views on 9/11 that we disagree upon. But that doesn't change this conversation. And that's a conversation for another day if you ever wanted to have it. I want to congratulate you on your book that got banned on Amazon. George Orwell would be very impressed about Sandy Hook. And I actually think that this, the flat earth kind of relates to the Sandy Hook story a little bit as the information is compiled by numerous people that all, collectively bring the information together, and then different people repackage it, add their own content, and then redistribute it and help get the truth out. So with that said, I want to make one more analogy. Adam Lanza is a lot like the gravitron. Gravitron, am I saying that right? He is only a theory. He's never been seen, and he does almost impossible things. Jim, one quick question. You don't believe that we went to the moon and then NASA faked it? Is that true?
Yes, that's true. There's overwhelming evidence we did not go to the moon. We didn't have the propulsive power. We didn't have the broadcast power back from the moon. It appears to have been elaborately staged for political purposes.
So with that, that brings you halfway to the argument that I'm making. The question is, why did they fake it? And we're going to get into that in my presentation, which I'm going to speak very fast. I'm going to go through a bunch of slides quickly. And get it done in the proper amount of time. You have an opportunity here to demonstrate your incredible deductive reasoning skills that you have done many times in the past, and get out ahead of the packs of intellectuals such as yourself with what is without question the biggest deception of all time. So with that said, I want you to just clear your head of any preconceived notions of what the flat earth is, and hear the information and think logically, and then we can see what happens from there. So Chance, if you want to bring up the first slide. The flat earth is an endless plane or a plane that goes on for an incredible amount of distance. It's frozen and parked in a circular orbit around a magnetic center is a capacitor. We'll call that the sun. So you're looking at this picture here. This is just like a puddle in the ice sheet, and the sun rotates around the center, and that creates the world that we know. Antarctica is not a continent on the bottom of a ball, but rather the ring that surrounds the planet. Next slide, please. The next slide, people ask, how do you circumnavigate people have circumnavigated the globe. Well, if you go west, you will go keeping north, the magnetic north to your right, equidistant, you'll just make a big flat circle. Next slide. And then if you go east, in the other direction, same thing. North is always to your center. The inner northern hemisphere is the center, and the outer southern hemisphere is is the southern part of the world. Next, if you go any direction away from north, you're going south. You'll hit the ice wall. And if you are able to get over it without one of the 40 nations that have a treaty that won't allow you to go there, you'll just keep continuing over the ice sheet and never return. Next, these three lines here, the red is the equator, the orange is the Tropic of Cancer, and the yellow is the Tropic of Capricorn. The sun circles around, making tighter circles in our summer. And then it goes to the yellow line in Australia's summer, making faster, wider circles. Continue to the next. Here is a picture of Australia's summer. Our winter, this is December 21st. The sun is making the big outer loop. Next. And then the next one is the northern inner hemisphere's summer, June 21st. It's nice and tight. We have some very long days, midnight sun in the North Pole, which we'll get to soon. Next, this is just an illustration of the sun lighting up part of the world. Everybody says, well, it would be light all the time, on the Earth. Well, that's because we believe that sunlight will travel for billions and trillions of miles, but that's not true at all. It goes a very short distance before it peters out, the wavelengths separate, the colors change, and it disappears. So this is a rough illustration of that. Next, this is just an illustration of, next slide, there you go, is an illustration of how a ship would go around the world. It's like walking around your neighborhood. You're not going around a sphere. You're making a big flat, circle, or, as close to a circle as you can get. Next, if you go south, you'll eventually hit the Antarctic ice wall, which surrounds the entire flat Earth. Next, this is the ice sheet. South is across the top of that sheet, and it just keeps on going and going and going. Next, you can consider go back one. You can consider this the meniscus of the melted puddle that holds all of the water in. Now we go to the next one. We've had one shot of the Earth, I think, since 1970 something or whatever the Apollo shot was, and then we recently got this new shot of the Earth, the big blue marble. It's on every iPhone. It's in every movie. And this was taken with NASA's new camera. Go ahead, next slide, called the DSCVR. And it's taken by the Earth Polychromatic Imaging Camera, the EPIC. And if you put that together, they're laughing in our faces. It's the EPIC Deceiver. Next. If you take a look at the picture that they're showing us, you'll see, if you zoom in, that it's a complete Photoshop, not even Photoshopped, it's a painting. And they used, to put the clouds in, they used Photoshop, and they stepped and repeated. They're very lazy at NASA. I guess they don't know what to do with all the trillions of dollars they stole from us, and they hire really crappy graphic artists. Next, every picture we've seen of a planet, these are two pictures of Earth from NASA. I think they're like 30 years apart or whenever they were taken, and they can't even get the proportions right on the planets. This is supposedly a picture of the Earth from space, and the United States is twice the size in one. Next. Every picture we have from NASA of a planet is a artist rendering. They're not real pictures. If you take a strong telescope and look at a planet, it looks nothing like this. It looks like a self-illuminating light. It looks more like a star. They used to call planets wandering stars. Next, Saturn, I've looked at myself through high-power telescopes, and it really looks like a light bulb. It doesn't look like it's reflecting light. The rings are lit up. There's none of these colors on there. And these are just artist renderings. And if you believe that they're real, you're just sadly mistaken. Next, we recently had Pluto, pictures of Pluto. The one kind of center bottom is the most recent one. And that was taken by a probe that was whizzing by Pluto. Pluto's spinning. There's barely any light out there. And it gets this perfect, brightly lit, crisp, clear image of Pluto and transmits it all the way back to Earth, where we can barely get cell phone signals, when you go out of town. Go to the next one. And if you look at it, again, Disney style, they show us this ridiculous picture, and Pluto is actually on the moon. I mean, on Pluto. They're literally laughing at us. Next, a lot of ball earthers say that the eclipse of the moon proves that the Earth is round because it's a curved shadow. To me, that doesn't look like much of a curved shadow. There's been many documented eclipses where the sun and the moon are above the horizon during the eclipse. The moon is self-illuminating, and it is not a big rock up in space. As a matter of fact, it's transparent. Next, if you look at this shot at night, the craters, or the dark spots, I like to call them, are black because it's in our sky and there's black sky behind it. Next, if you look at the full moon during the day, those spots are now blue because we are seeing through whatever the moon is. And to prove that, go to the next one. We have a crescent moon, and behind the moon was a planet. And when you zoom in, you can see the planet through the moon. This shot was proven that there was a planet in that position, and you could see it behind the moon. And there's many people that have photographed this many times. Next, one of the first things that woke me up to the flat Earth was that no matter where you are, at sea level, at the top of Mount Everest, top of a building, or in an airplane, the horizon is always at eye level. It's always at eye level. And on a ball Earth, like on the left, as you rise up, the horizon should drop off, but that's not what we see. We always see the horizon at eye level. Next, here's a little exaggerated picture of what it looks like from an airplane. The horizon not only should drop off in front of you, but it should drop off more visibly to the left and to the right. And the equation for that is 8 inches per mile squared. So as you get up over 100 miles, the drop is drastic. Next. This is a shot from 20 miles up from a hot air balloon, or a helium balloon. The horizon is flat, and Google Earth says at the same height, this is what the Earth looks like, and they're just faking it. That's not what the Earth looks like, because there's a picture of what the Earth looks like. Next, here's a shot of Dubai. I believe it's Dubai. If you look in the horizon is at eye level from the elevation that they're at, and it is flat. Next, another shot showing just a straight flat horizon. Next, this is what this is a shot that they'll show us just from a tower. This is not even this is obviously a fisheye lens, which bends the Earth. If the Earth had this kind of curve to it, it would be very, very small. Next, here's a shot. I believe it's the top of Mount Everest, flat horizon once again. And look at that sun. Does that look 93 million miles away? That sun is close. It's within our sky, and we'll get more into that in a moment. But some people will look at this picture, they'll put a straight edge on it, and they'll say, look, it's a little bowing out, and it looks like a circle, but again, it's a flat circle. Next picture. This is my dining room table. It is not a ball. It's a flat circle. And that's how we see. We see the same distance to the vanishing point in all directions. So when you look to the left at 9 o'clock, you see X distance to 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, X distance. You draw a line, connect all those distances. You're drawing a big flat circle, and that's what you're seeing. But our programming tells us it's a ball. Next. Here's just a few more shots. We have a balloon. Again, look how close the sun looks. Cruising altitude about 5 miles up, sea level, flat, straight horizon. Next, here's a shot with a level, and you're looking across the level. Your eyes are level with the level, and there is the water. Straight, does not bear off, does not fold over backwards. Water is level. Next. Again, another shot, impossible if the Earth is a ball. Continue. Here is the famous Felix Baumgarten Red Bull jump, and everyone uses this as proof that it's a ball. When he opened the door and you looked out, there was a straight shot across. It was only a little bit of the horizon, but it did not look curved like this. But if you can argue that all day because it was only a little bit, and some people might say there's a curve. But below him is New Mexico. Last time I looked, New Mexico did not cover a third of the planet. This is a low altitude shot with a fisheye lens. Next, this is a shot from the dog cam, which is 110,000 feet, just slightly lower than the Felix's shot. And again, the horizon is flat, straight, and the sun is very close. Next, here again, check out the sun. The sun is very close within our sky, and notice the hot spot, the reflection on the Earth. Straight horizon. Next. We'll talk about the vanishing point a little bit. These lines are parallel the way we see. They don't look parallel here, but if you flick to the next one, these are the corners of the hallway. and they rush to the point of convergence or the vanishing point. And that's how our eyes see. Everything rushes in from the sides, the top and the bottom to our point of focus. And that's the vanishing point. The sky has no bumps on it. The sky is smooth, but the earth has bumps on it. It has mountains, it has trees, it has cars, people, waves. Anything that comes across the flat plane that even rises up a little bit will create a false horizon in front of that vanishing point. So if you look at the light on the ceiling and imagine that's the sun, the sun's not getting any closer to the floor, but it is going down. And if you had some bumps in the hallway or some people standing down the hallway, the sun would disappear. That light would disappear behind their heads from the bottom up, just like we observe on this plane. Next, here's just a shot across the flat plane, how everything goes to the convergence point. Next, here's a shot, a slide I made, where the point of convergence, the vanishing point, is behind that mountain, and that mountain is creating a false horizon. So as the sun moves into the distance, it gets smaller and smaller, remaining the same height above the flat plane, and then it disappears from the bottom up as it disappears behind the false horizon. Next. This is an experiment that was done years ago. It's called the Bedford Level Experiment. It's a canal in England that's 66 miles straight. A guy put a camera just inches above the water. He got a rowboat with a little flag, and he put the camera on the flag, rowed all the way down to the end, and he could see the flag the whole time when there should be 24 feet of curvature according to spherical geometry. 24 feet of curvature. There wasn't any curvature at all. And that's just 6 miles. Next. This is the picture in the background is from Time and Day, the website. And then the picture from the front is the blue marble. Where's Europe? Where's Australia? In this picture, it shows Australia is in the light at the same orientation that this picture is, but it's really on the other side of the planet. So the reason that it spreads out like that is because the southern hemisphere is not a ball. It's not rounded like the same as the upper northern hemisphere. It's the outer flat stretched out southern plane. I'm going to stop using the word hemisphere because that leads you to a ball mentality. Next, the Statue of Liberty. Everyone's familiar with that. It's visible from 60 miles away. That's over 2,000 feet of curvature, but you can see it on a clear day. Next, this is a lighthouse. 180 feet tall. It should be 996 feet below the curve of the earth, but boats can see it from 42 miles out. Next, this is a series of islands that can be seen. I believe the one on the left is 125 miles away. That's almost 2 miles of curvature, but it can be seen out across the flat level ocean. Water does not bend, it's flat. Next, this is the Great Salt Flat. It's 90 miles wide, and it's perfectly level. It only varies by a couple of feet from end to end, and it should be over a mile of curvature from end to end, and it's flat. You know, if you have a strong enough telescope on a clear day, you can see somebody standing on the far end. Impossible on a ball Earth. Next. We're told that the sun is 93 million miles away. If you look at the top of the picture, and all of the rays come into the sun from edge to edge to the equator to the center at the same angle, and they're straight rays. And that is how, next slide, that Eratosthenes determined the size of the globe, where he said, okay, he took one stick. The sun, it has no shadow. He knew how far the other stick was. The rays are coming in parallel. He measured the shadow. He did some simple math. And he said, the earth is a ball. This proves it. Next slide. But unfortunately, you can get the same exact results if the sun is about 3,000 miles away, just about out of the frame there, and about 30 miles across. And on a flat earth, you can get the exact same results with the shadow on one and no shadow on the other. Next. There's many times where you see these rays coming through the sun. I think they're called, I'm going to butcher the word, perspicular rays or whatever. You can laugh at me. These rays are splaying out because the sun is not that high. And if it was 93 million miles away, those rays would be straight. Go to the next one. Here's a clearer picture of those rays spreading out, and also a picture of a street light behind a tree, creating the same rays. We know that the street light is very close, and so is the sun. Next, here's an experiment. I believe the YouTube name is P-Brain, but if it's somebody else, I apologize. He created a fake cloud, which is cardboard with holes in it, put a light right over it, and it created those same splayed out rays. Then he brought it outside, and with the sun being high enough for this model, the rays were straight because it was far away. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the sun is close and within our sky. Next. Here's a shot from the dog cam again. Does that sun look 93 million miles away? No, it's not. It's local. And every time we send a balloon up to these high altitudes, the sun is never over the balloon. It's always off to the side because the angle of the sun changes because the distance is greatly reduced, or the percentage of the distance. And if you look right below the sign there's a hot spot on the clouds from the sun. That could never happen if the sun was 93 million miles away. It can only happen when the light source is very close. Next, this is there it is again, just with the sun out of the picture. The hot spot, the sun is not high, not much higher above the clouds, whether it's 1,000 miles, a couple thousand miles, or a couple hundred miles. I don't know the answer to that. Next. Here is the sun on the top one. It's 93 million miles away, and then the Earth moves 3,000 miles, barely any difference, and it's that much bigger. You shouldn't see any difference in the size if the sun was 93 million miles away. This is 3,000 miles makes the sun much, much closer percentage-wise, and that's why you see a difference in the size of the sun. Next, here's from the time lapse in Africa. This is the first shot of the sun going away, and then we go to the next shot, and look how small it is. The sun's rays, the light is barely getting to us. The sun is getting smaller, and that is because it's going into the distance, and soon it's going to hit the vanishing point or the false horizon from the bumps on the land, and it's going to disappear and set. Next. This is a flight that recently went from Bali to LAX, and it was halfway to Hawaii. You can see Hawaii along the line there. When a woman went into labor and they had to make an emergency landing, the pilot could have turned around, which didn't make sense. He could have stopped in Hawaii, or he could have continued to LAX. Those are the best three options. But instead, next slide, he decided to go to Alaska. Now, why would he do that? It makes no sense at all. Next slide. And the reason is because on a flat Earth, it's a straight line. The plane on that line is in Alaska. Hawaii is way off to the right, and LAX is is farther ahead. So Alaska is the way to go. If you track packages around the world that are going to that side of the world, they all go through Alaska, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever on a ball Earth. Next, recently a pilot filmed a flight with a camera out the window that left LAX and went to Frankfurt, Germany. It went over, close to the pole, up the polar route, they call it, I guess. The sun was to the west. It was late afternoon. Go to the next slide. And the entire flight, you can see sunlight. If you look at the little map on the right, the sun is way off. It should be on the other side of the planet. It should be 5,000 miles or more over the horizon. But you can see the sun the entire time. It goes away and then it comes back because it's traveling in a flat circle across a flat plane. Next. There's no shortcuts on a flat Earth. That's why when you fly from Australia to Chile, it goes up to the northern hemisphere or into the northern hemisphere, across the United States and down, which makes absolutely no sense unless you look at it on a flat Earth. On the right, it's a straight line, and that's how all planes fly. Now, you will be able to find a couple of flights that say they do fly from there, but you can't book them, you can't fly them, and they don't exist. Next. This is a chart of all of the internet cables, communication cables. None of them go across the Southern Ocean because there is no shortcut on a flat Earth. We could dive into that deeper later. Next, NASA and their imagery. NASA is laughing at us with everything they show us. They've never done anything. There are no astronauts have been to space. There are no satellites. There is no space station. And we've never been to the moon, and we've never been into outer space because it's not what we think. Next, this is what they show us as imagery of the space station. We have the space shuttle connected to that. Think of the torques and the twists and, just by movement of humans pushing off the walls, this thing never breaks down. If it ever does break down, they go on a spacewalk in their clunky suit and they can fix it with a screwdriver. I mean, our cars break down here on a hot summer day or cold winter. This thing is up there getting beaten by heat and meteors and stuff. And if you think about a submarine, every compartment has a sealed door and hatches, and they have to be maintained all the time. But they're never fixing these. There are no sealed doors between the compartments in the space station. They're wide open doors. There's nothing to protect one part from the other, and people just assume that there are, but there's not. Next frame. Here's a shot of the Earth from 1969 versus a more recent shot. Doesn't make any sense. It's a cartoon. Next. The top shot is a clip from the recent transit of the moon across the Earth. Of course, the sun is directly behind us. It's a perfect shot. That's supposedly the backside of the moon. It's a total cartoon. The one on the bottom right is the shot when we were on the moon, but that's what the Earth looks like. The Earth is so much bigger than the moon. It should like the picture on the bottom left. Next. If we're on a ball Earth, when you're flying at cruising altitude, the plane needs to dip down every minute, a substantial amount. Otherwise, it would fly off into space. The only way that wouldn't happen is if air is curved also. Otherwise, the plane is going to lift, just keep going, and it's going to fly into outer space. And that just doesn't happen. And the pilots do not go down because they're flying over a flat plane. Next. Satellites in space, are covered in tinfoil. There's 10,000 to 30,000 of them. They can't tell us how many. They always work. They don't break down. There's micrometeors out there, G-forces, plasma, gamma radiation, heat, cold, meteor storms, Van Allen radiation belt, electromagnetism, all sorts of stuff that should destroy these things, but they all survive. They're all fine. They don't melt. Next, the Hubble telescope doesn't exist. We've never seen a picture from it. It never turned towards Earth. It never took a picture of Earth or the moon. Go to the next picture. It's in the thermosphere that gets up to thousands of degrees. It should look like that, but it doesn't because it's not up there and it's fake. Next, the definition of irony is that all of the agencies that control the world, their logos have flat Earth maps. They're laughing at us, they're mocking us, and they're sticking it in our faces. Next. They love their numerology. The Earth has a 23.4 degree tilt. Subtract that from 90, 666. Next. Here's Stanley Kubrick collaborating with NASA to fake the moon landings. We're in agreement with that. Next. We all remember the shuttle Challenger disaster. Well, that something blew up, but there was nobody on it. And all of these astronauts have identical twins still here on Earth with the exact same name as them now, all working for universities. You can look that up. There's videos that'll show you more about that. It's a complete and utter hoax. Next, go to the last slide. This is what I call puddle theory. This is just a theory that I have. It may or may not be true. There may only be one place, but this infinite flat plane could have other capacitors orbiting around a magnetic north, melting other puddles, if I could speak. And this is where, if you believe in extraterrestrials, well, I call them earthly terrestrials. They're coming from thousands of miles away instead of millions and billions of incomprehensible light years. And that's all I have to say. The Earth is flat and does not move, and there is no proof otherwise that the Earth is a spinning ball. Jim, I did it in under 30 minutes. You were wrong.
Well, I think it was slightly over, but that's okay, David. Anyway, Chance, what we have seen is an illustration of the principle well known to philosophers of science that if you adopt a certain position and want to maintain that come what may, then you can, by adopting a whole host of ad hoc and auxiliary hypotheses, defend it. For example, if you were on a train and wanted to maintain that you were the motionless center of the universe, then you could maintain that if you assume that the entire Earth was passing by, that other causal relations were incredibly complicated and so forth, if you wanted to preserve that. I think David has given an almost perfect illustration of that principle. Several aspects of what he has said seem to me to result from some elementary confusions. One in particular, that the science of topology concerns relationships between features in a given structure or universe, as it were. Think of it as rubber sheet geometry. You could draw a model of the planet, of north and south hemisphere, and so forth, and then stretch it any way you want. And you could preserve the basic qualitative relationships between those, but not the quantitative. And some of what David has suggested here seems to me to founder on what have to be calculational mistakes. For example, the amount of curvature per distance seems to me wildly off base. I began to look at this only earlier today, and I can't give you the exact number now, but I can tell you that it does not look right to me. Now, we have had many models of the universe from ancient times, beginning with the idea that Earth was the center of the universe, moving to a model that the sun was the center of the universe, moving to a model that the sun is only one small part, a solar system in a remote corner of a galaxy known as the Milky Way, surrounded by billions and billions of stars and other planets and other systems and so forth. Well, what I'm going to do here with the amount of time available to me is simply offer some observations as to why, although it's not logically impossible, in other words, the description David has given isn't inconsistent, such as describing something as being both square and round at the same time, which isn't even a mathematical possibility. But it seems to me to have no scientific foundation at all, and that some of the moves he made were intended to thwart what are perfectly legitimate arguments. For example, the work by Eratosthenes in 240 BC establishing that the Earth was round based upon the propagation of sunlight in straight lines. David suggested if you were to move the sun around arbitrarily, make it much closer, you could get those kinds of angle differentiations, not based upon a round Earth, but rather a flat. And that's no doubt the case. But the fact of the matter is that the distances between planets, the sun, Earth, and so forth are not arbitrary and capable of elastic variation. I want to begin, therefore, with a short study by Eratosthenes that's really exemplifies principles that it seems to me, other than by making arbitrary assumptions about the distance of the sun to Earth, are already incapable of being overcome by those who want to defend a flat Earth. So, Chance, if we might, let's begin with that short take about Eratosthenes. It's only about 2 minutes.
How would you set about to measure the Earth with the mathematical knowledge and tools you already possess? A Greek named Eratosthenes did it 240 years before Christ. He was head of the great library of Alexandria in Egypt, a city built by the Greeks. He, like others, suspected that the world was round. After all, the sun and the moon were round. He had also noticed that the sun's rays fell in parallel lines. Greeks before him had divided the circle into degrees and had measured angles. With this information and a logical mind, he measured the Earth. Here is how. While visiting the city of Syene one midsummer's day, Eratosthenes noticed that the reflection of the sun could be seen in the bottom of a deep well. The sun was overhead, and the rays pointed to the center of the Earth. He remembered this, and on the next midsummer's day in Alexandria, he measured the shadow cast by an obelisk. Sunbeams travel in parallel lines, so the difference in angle had to result from the curvature of the Earth. If the angle was 1/50th of a circle, then the distance around the world must be 50 times the distance from Alexandria to Syene. With these simple tools, Eratosthenes made this almost exact measurement of the world more than 1,700 years before Magellan sailed around it. He was a friend of Archimedes. He was a mathematician and a poet, invented the sieve for finding prime numbers, was the first geographer, and corrected the calendar to the one we use today.
Now, of course, the precise circumference of the Earth, when it depends upon the distance between those two locations that represents 1/50th of the circumference. Here in the first slide, for example, is a calculation based on somewhat different assumptions that yields the approximation of the circumference of the Earth at 28,968 miles. We know today more exact measurements make the Earth at the equator 24,901 miles around, but north to south pole only 24,859, which is why it's slightly thicker in the middle and is technically qualified as an oblate spheroid. If you look at the next slide, you'll see that, again, depending on the distance assumed, that if we're doing this in terms of measured by stadia, we get a result of 35,000 miles. This is not very surprising when you consider that measurements of distance at that time were often calculated in how far a camel could walk in a day. So we get those kinds of oddities and variation. But there's no doubt that Eratosthenes established already an argument for the Earth being round that it seems to me are impossible to satisfy by a flat Earth without making arbitrary assumptions such as moving the sun closer to Earth than can withstand calculation by astronomers and physicists through generations. Here's a third slide. This is a model of a flat Earth. Now, David has given us a different one, and he seems to have boundless ice outward, but it's going to have some finite dimensions. I've often wondered, what is supposed to support the flat Earth? There was an ancient theory that it was the Earth was, a sphere or a disk floating in space. Others had it on the back of a tortoise. And then they say, well, what was a tortoise on? And then they say, well, that was on the back of an elephant. And some would say, well, what about the elephant? And the reply might be elephants all the way down. The fact is, you need to have some physical principles that explain the location of the Earth and why we don't seem to fall off the edge, why everything is really consistent with the Earth being circular rather than the Earth being flat. Here on the next slide, we see what is a common representation of the cosmos. There are all kinds of stars everywhere, and they all strikingly seem to be circular in their character. Remember, even Eratosthenes, in contemplating the possibility that the Earth was round, reflected that the sun is round and the moon is round. Here's a model now based on the calculation of or characterization of the constellations in the next slide, which just reflects the antiquity of our study of the stars. I mean, this goes back thousands and thousands of years, where navigators at sea, for example, could operate very successfully on the assumption that the Earth was a small stationary ball in the center of a much larger sphere that was populated with all these stars. The next shows a simple model of an Earth, and you have a moon and so forth. This is an ancient Indian representation, as I recall. But many of the early, as slide 7 shows, positive models of Earth posited that Earth was the center of the universe and the sun rotated around the Earth. And of course, it would be undergo what was known as the Copernican revolution, when Copernicus argued that actually you get a much simpler model. Everything works better if you assume that the sun is the center and the Earth goes around the sun, rather than the sun going around the Earth. But just as in the case of the flat Earth model that David has described, these are logically possible alternatives. They simply induce different kinds of complications and complexity if you hold fast, just as if you assume that traveling on a train, you're actually the motionless center of the universe, and the world is simply whirling past you, and all kinds of causal relations are far more complex. The next slide shows what is a common photograph of a galaxy where the Milky Way is presumed to be very similar, and the sun and our planets would be just a remote speck in a galaxy rather like that one. Now, if you turn to current models of our solar system, this the next slide shows. Typically, we have the sun at the center, the Jupiter, Saturn, the other planets circling around it. This is even studied by, for example, 6th graders, as you see in the next slide, number 10, where a young boy did his 6th grade science project, a model of Earth that corresponds to a high degree of approximation with what contemporary physicists and astronomers would assert. Now, in the next slide 11, you see what Galileo observed Jupiter and its moons through a telescope. He was the greatest scientist of his time for both conducting terrestrial experiments about falling bodies and formulating the law of free fall, but also by turning a telescope to the heavens and observing the phenomena there, where you see an example of Jupiter and its 4 largest moons on the right, although the distance and sizes are not to scale. This very much gave Galileo and other scientists of the time the impression of a model of what Earth in relation to the sun would look like. In the next, we see a variety of images of Earth from space. And while I grant that we did not make a manned mission to the moon, that does not preclude unmanned missions to the moon and elsewhere, which seem to have yielded these kinds of photographs, which I take to be involved no form of fraud at all. Here's another now, recognizing the role of the seasons. The Earth is circulating around the sun, but sometimes it's closer, sometimes it's further away. When it's closer, things are hotter. We have summer. When it's farther away, things are cooler. We have winters. So we actually have ways of calculating, the basic elements of time based upon the relationship between the sun, the moon, and Earth. Here's another now, number 14, about the rotation, the directions north, south, east, west, based on the way the planet rotates or turns. Earth rotates around an imaginary line running through its center called an axis of rotation. The ends of the axis are the north and south poles. Any location on the surface moves from west to east as Earth turns. If you extend your right thumb and pretend its tip is the North Pole, then your fingers curve the way Earth rotates. At any one time, about half of Earth is in sunlight and half is dark. However, Earth turns on its axis in 24 hours, so locations move through the light and darkness in that time. When a location is in sunlight, it is daytime there. When its location is in the middle of the sunlit side, it is noon. When a location is in darkness, it is night there. And when the location is the middle of the unlit side, it is midnight. Now, our basic units of time measurement, as the next slide shows, follow from astronomical phenomena. A year is the amount of time it takes for the Earth to rotate around the sun. A month, the time it takes for the moon to rotate around the Earth. And the day, the amount of time Earth rotates around its axis. Here are some elementary proofs about the circularity of Earth. 1, the moon, and a photo of a lunar eclipse. Now that humanity knows that the moon is not a piece of cheese or a playful god, the phenomena that accompany it from its monthly cycles to lunar eclipses are well explained. It was quite a mystery to the ancient Greeks, though, and in their quest for knowledge, they came up with a few insightful observations that helped humanity figure out the shape of our planet. Aristotle, who made quite a lot of observations about the spherical nature of the Earth, noticed that during lunar eclipses, when the Earth's orbit places it directly between the sun and the moon, creating a shadow in the process, the shadow on the moon's surface is round. This shadow is the Earth, and it's a great clue on the spherical shape of Earth. Since the Earth is rotating, see the Foucault pendulum, to which I shall turn momentarily, the consistent oval shadow it produces in each and every lunar eclipse proves that Earth is not only round, but spherical, absolutely, utterly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, not flat. Look at the next slide now. Ships in the horizon. If you've been next to a port lately or just strolled down a beach and stared off vacantly into the horizon, you might have perhaps noticed a very interesting phenomenon. Approaching ships do not just appear out of the horizon like they would have if the Earth was flat, but rather emerge from beneath the sea. But you say ships do not submerge and rise up again as they approach our view, except perhaps in Pirates of the Caribbean, but we're hereby assuming that was fictional. The reason ships appear as they emerge from the water is because the Earth is not flat, it is round. And I would observe, by the way, that many of the observations David was making are reflective of the fact on a very large spherical surface, relatively small portions of that surface would appear to be flat. Here's another argument: the varying star constellation. This observation was originally made by Aristotle, who declared the Earth was round, judging from the different constellation one sees while moving away from the equator. After returning from a trip to Egypt, Aristotle noticed there are stars seen in Egypt and Cyprus which are not seen in the northerly regions. This phenomenon can only be explained with a round surface, and Aristotle continued and claimed that the sphere of the Earth is of no great size, for otherwise the effect of so slight a change of place would not be quickly apparent. The farther you go from the equator, the farther the known constellation go toward the horizon and are replaced by different stars. This would not have happened if the world was flat. Next, shadows and sticks. If you stick a stick in the sticky ground, it will produce a shadow. The shadow moves as time passes, which is the principle for ancient shadow clocks or sundials. If the world had been flat, then the sticks at different locations would produce the same shadow, but they don't. This is because the Earth is round and not flat. Eratosthenes used this principle to calculate the circumference of the Earth quite accurately. To see this demonstrated, refer to my experimental video about Eratosthenes and the circumference of the Earth, rather like the one we've already seen. Next slide. Seen farther from higher. Standing at a flat plateau, you look ahead toward the horizon. You strain your eyes and take out your favorite binoculars and stare through them as far as your eyes, with the help of the binocular lenses, can see. Then you climb up the closest tree. The higher, the better. Be careful not to drop those binoculars and break their lenses. Then you look again, strain your eyes, stare through the binoculars out to the horizon. The higher up you are, the farther you will see. Usually we tend to relate this to earthly obstacles, like the fact that we have houses or other trees obstructing our vision on the ground, and climbing upward, we have a clear view. But that's not the true reason. Even if you had to have a completely clear plateau with no obstacles between you and the horizon, you would see much farther from greater height than you would on the ground. This phenomenon is caused by the curvature of the Earth as well, and would not happen if Earth was flat. Finally, we come to the Foucault pendulum, which is at different locations reflects the curvature, the rotation of the Earth as the effect. The Foucault's pendulum is in the Pantheon in Paris. There's an animation at the upper right where the green traces the path of the pendulum bob over the ground, which is a rotating reference frame where you wouldn't get this variation if the Earth were not rotating. I would thus summarize in terms of the next slide that we have to evaluate the difference between our subjective degree of conviction and the amount of objective support. Even friends of my acquaintance who are pilots have observed that it's easy to discern the curvature of the Earth when you're at a high altitude. I have no doubt about that. There's no doubt that classical physics would be impossible under the stipulations posited by David and others who are disposed to believe in flat Earth. Finally, let me mention a few references. Classic, I.B. Cohen, The Birth of a New Physics, Thomas Kuhn, The Copernican Revolution, both take us through the elementary history of the development of models of the universe and the role of physics in determining. Online, you can find resources like 10 Ways to Know Earth is Not Flat, Flat Earth Wikipedia, How We Know the Earth is Round. In the few minutes that remain, I want to invite Chance George, my producer, who's taken a keen interest in these issues, to offer comments of his own. But he only has about 3 minutes, given that our second hour actually is longer than an hour by a few minutes. Chance.
Well, I just wanted to say, well, first I didn't have any slides and I didn't have anything drastically prepared, but just as an observer, first of all, you both, you go through your information and you both have common ground. No one believes that NASA is telling the truth. We don't believe the official story on 90% of the stories that are coming out in the mainstream. So it's almost like someone looking from the outside, not familiar with this, might think that Jim and David are on opposing sides. They're just merely butting heads on one issue, while they both agree that a lot of the official story is some BS that's coming down. We know that the moon landing obviously was fake. There's tons of evidence that supports that we're not being told the truth. Now, I just see that kind of, when we see things like Obama mentioning in speeches that the Flat Earth Society, he doesn't want to have conversations about it. To me, that kind of means that if he's bringing it up, it's almost like it's been planted there. If you want to take the people who are talking about Sandy Hook, if you want to take the 9/11 people, and you want to try and discredit them in some way, you've got to have something you can prove them wrong with. So let's say that the flat Earth is something that is wrong, and we have people who are really good researchers coming out and basically supporting it. When you prove that they're wrong about the flat Earth, now you basically say, well, you were wrong, you thought the Earth was flat, so now I'm not going to believe you about 9/11, or I think that Sandy Hook, you're wrong about that because you were wrong about the Earth being flat. So I just really hope that people in the movement, although I love that they're searching out for truths and they're not believing and they're researching, I just really hope that before we all kind of go out on a limb, we've got to really be sure of what we're portraying and be able to prove some of these things, so that we don't, all get lumped in the same pile and basically kind of maybe get our messages that we're working hard that we can prove kind of cut off by this. That's just my
Chance,
point.
Thanks for those comments, David. I want to thank you for coming on and presenting quite a large amount of information in a relatively brief span of time. I commend you and Sophia for your work on Sandy Hook, and I, of course, continue to disagree with you about your views regarding Earth, which seem to me to contradict the history of astronomy and physics, but I'm nevertheless grateful for your appearing here today to defend those views. This is Jim Fetzer, your host, thanking my special guest for this first hour, David Weiss, for being here.